Hey, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion and webinar about NIST CSF 2.0, what to expect. Um, the most exciting topic of the year. I will say, actually, really exciting in the way that we have more registrants for this event than we had for any event that we've done, except for the urgent panels, the ones where there's a big ransomware attack, or when the White House cyber strategy came out or something like that. So welcome everybody. We're expecting a big crowd today. And one of the things that if you've been to our webinars before, people like using the chat, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, a couple of things to know. Number one, there is a chat on the right. I love that people are already telling us where they're joining from. So let us know where you're joining from in the chat. There's a little bell in the upper right of the chat. And if you want the chat to ding, you can turn off the bell. And if you want chat ding, you can mute the chat and hit the bell. Everybody who has registered for this will get a recording from this, and we will also put it on our YouTube channel. People always want to know, will you get the slide deck? Yes, you'll get the slide deck. And this is going to be a really helpful slide deck. So what we'll do is, after the whole thing, either late today or tomorrow, we'll send out a PDF of the slide deck. There are also some handouts that folks are going to want, a spreadsheet and the like, and we'll send all of those out. We'll also put some links to things as it comes today. So if you haven't been to our events before and you don't know who we are, Critical Insight defends critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. That means that we help organizations prepare for attacks. We help them detect attacks quickly with our security operations centers, and we help them respond decisively through rapid quarantine actions and incident response teams. But enough about us. Oh, wait, no, let's talk more about us. Mike Hamilton and Fred Langston both founded the company. Mike is the former CISO of the city of Seattle, and he's the CISO of the company. Fred is our chief product officer, and he has run consulting for a very long time, and so has done more NIST CSF-based security assessments than you can shake a stick at. And my name is Jake Milstein. I run the events for Critical Insight and run marketing. So if you don't like our website, you can let me know. Okay. Mike, why don't you take people through the risk equation? As we start this one, we're going to go through some definitions of things because it's going to get complex. So we're going to define a few things. Mike, risk equation.
Yeah, well, and one of the things we're going to land on. So first of all, let me say hi to all the folks I know here. Hi, Twyla. Hi, Mike Hamilton from Northwest Arkansas and other places, who is the CISO for a law firm. Thanks for stealing my name. I want to. We're gonna land on risk assessment and the use of the NIST CSF for conducting your own risk assessment. And I just want to acknowledge Lou Garcia, who's on here, who's the CISO at Clear Channel Outdoor Signage Company and airports and other things, because he really put a lot of work into that sheet. And that's the one. It's also the process of record for Clear Channel as well. So hey, Lou, it's good to see you here. So let's talk about risk. Okay, so there's two components to this, right? Risk is the product of two things: the likelihood that a bad thing happens and the consequence of that bad thing happening. And so when we think about what's a bad thing, it's not, a person got malware. It's not, a buffer overflow, a SQL injection attack against a website defeat. That's not a bad thing. A bad thing is loss of protected records, theft, extortion, disruption just for the sake of knocking you down, or you being used to attack others as a launching point. Okay, so when you're going through your risk calculation, keep that in mind. Those are really the bad things. So the probability of one of those bad things happening, all right, multiplied by its impact. And if you want to buy down risk by addressing that likelihood term, you apply preventive controls, firewalls, train your users, manage your vulnerabilities, filter your email, all that stuff, right? And you will never get that all the way to zero. That risk doesn't go all the way to zero just through the application of preventive controls. Then you have to work with impact. So impact is addressed through monitoring, investigation, and effective response, right? Put out the little fire before it gets big and engulfs the house in ransomware flames. Okay. So we're going to land on this. And I thought it was important to just take a minute and go through this, right? Buying down risk by addressing those two terms, because we've done modifications to the NIST cybersecurity framework to turn it into a risk assessment sheet rather than alignment with the framework. And hopefully at the end of this hour, all that will make much more sense.
All right.
That makes sense
What
to you,
is?
Fred?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's seen before. All right, go ahead, Mike. You wanted
Okay,
to
so
explain what the CSF is. CSF.
What in the world is the CSF? So, the cybersecurity framework, commonly called the CSF, it is from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it was developed specifically by the Obama administration, tasked NIST with developing this so that it could be a standard of practice that was applicable to any size organization in any sector. It is outcome based. It is not prescriptive. It doesn't say have this control in place. It says make this thing happen. And so how you do that really is up to you. You kind of design this and answer the questions based on your own capabilities. If you're a small company, those answers are going to be different than if you're a large company, right? So one of the examples I like to use is remote access is managed. All right. If you're a large enterprise, you probably got a real slick system for doing that with tools that you bought to make sure that remote access is managed and your vendors are locked out until they need. Or maybe they just call you on the phone and say, hey, I went in. You open up the firewall, let them in. When they're done, you close it off. Same thing. You have met the outcome. For the critical sectors, it is being, and I'm going to word this carefully, being strongly advocated as the standard of record for which critical infrastructure sectors should align. And so there is a sector specific agency that is assigned to every critical sector. So the EPA, for example, is the sector specific agency for the water sector. And there's some water folks on here. They are allowed to, through the rulemaking process, set requirements for those critical sectors. So lately, and this all kind of got launched from the Colonial Pipeline thing when we found out that the TSA was the sector specific agency for pipelines, and they weren't really telling the pipeline operators anything about cybersecurity, right? And so all that's different now, and the sector specific agencies have been given their walk-in papers to say, you're going to go out and you are going to get your sector aligned with the NIST framework so that we can do this consistently across the spectrum of critical sectors. That there's a lot of benefits to that. Maybe we'll land on those later. It is universal. We use it. You should use it. If your SSA says you have to use it, so for example, the Coast Guard is telling ports that they need to do a cybersecurity assessment as part of their, I believe it's biennial facilities security plan. They want you to use this. All right. So everybody needs to get on board with this. And I will say, and I know I'm taking too long here, that when we are talking about some of the things in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, specifically where it's talking about the use of the federal purse to be able to get security on the front end from the manufacturers rather than we all bolt it on after we buy it, that's eventually going to land on everyone. If you do business with a business that does business with the Department of Defense or some federal agency, that means they're going to be looking at you, right? Even though you're not selling directly to the federal government, they're going to be looking at you to make sure that you have done what you need to do to align yourself with some standard of practice, and this is the one to use because really it's the easiest one to use. All right, I'm going to quit talking. Go ahead. Unless I get the next slide, then I'm going to keep talking.
No. So vocabulary. So as we put this together, we went back to the NIST website just to settle on common vocabulary here because people after the NIST CSF came out, developed all sorts of different vocabularies, all sorts of different vendors came up with their own. So we're going to use the ones from the NIST website. So on the left, these are the ones that folks are familiar with. The identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Those are functions. And then within that, there are categories and subcategories. So I just want to set that up as we talk about this so folks know what we're talking about. Fred.
Yeah. So the comment periods ended, meaning they finally got all the feedback. They need the new version. They say will be out after 5/31. Does that mean it could mean 2 weeks? Could mean end of June, but we would expect sometime in the next month for the final edited version to drop. I would expect, I've been through this kind of comment process before. What we've seen in the latest update is probably going to have only minor changes. So what's in the latest version of the comment version is probably, maybe a few words off from what's going to finally be published. So let's go to the next slide, Jake, and let's talk about kind of what's going on here. The old world, right? Everybody loves a good security wheel slide. This is kind of how we did the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? A continuous cycle of activity. Now go to the next slide, and we're going to learn. They've decided to add another there we go. Add another piece to the pie here, which is a govern function. Now, as we get to later slides, you're going to find out how govern was part of it before and how it's become its own. Now we talk a function, right? So govern is now one of the functions. So govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Why is govern in the front? Because if you don't set up a program and the goals of the program and who's going to do the activities in the program, then you get to who does identify, who does protect, et cetera, et cetera. That's why govern's there. It needs to tell you who does these things, right? Who's responsible for this? Next slide, please. All right, we're going to talk about kind of what's in and what's out here. Okay, the things that are in, things that are out. So if you're familiar with the previous NIST, they've added more than they've removed. And when they say they've removed things to like, hey, this is specific to critical infrastructure, because in fact, this is so widely used and so applicable to everyone. They're saying, wait a minute, it's everybody should be using this. It was built originally for critical infrastructure and it's been tested that way. It's widely used now by everybody. It's perfect for everyone in any space now. They want also to think about prevention is really focused in govern, identify, and protect. So as Mike showed that risk equation, we're talking about buying down that vulnerability probability, right? The probability they're going to take advantage of something. That's what they're leaning into in terms of risk. When they talk about detection and response of incidents, it's detect, respond, and recover. Now we're looking on the managing the impact. So you can see that NIST has already aligned these things. And in their publication, they're aligning it directly with the move to a risk assessment approach. They're saying it in so many words here that they want this to move in that direction. They added, governance used to be under identify, right? It was a small component. It's been moved to a complete new function now. So this is again, they're learning, they're modifying this, they're adding some components that they believe are critical to the overall function. I would suggest that this 2.0 is maturing to a really mature state. I mean, sometimes it takes 4 versions to get to where some of these are really starting to get hit their stride. This is finally really, I think, landing on something that is going to stay the way it is for a long time. Next slide, please. A bunch of things are now in. So let's talk about some of the new things that they've added into the framework here. Supply chain risk. We all know, I think we've probably given 2 or 3 webinars just this year on all the dangers of supply chain risk. They're calling it out specifically now. So you're going to have a whole component that talks about managing your supply chain, your vendors, the people you contract with, how you're managing those relationships. Got to make sure. So interesting. Continuous improvement is now one of the subcategories of identify. Okay, what is continuous improvement? Well, this comes from the capability maturity model, like 1 through 5. You're ad hoc at the bottom. At 5, you're like continuously improving everything you have. This is a concept. We need to get better all the time. doing incremental change means you carry risk for that entire period in which you're waiting to make the change. Let's keep whittling down risk on a continuous basis. They're talking again more about, if you're protecting, we need to think about all aspects. Everybody thinks protect, oh, it's a firewall, it's antivirus, it's, you know, some other control. Well, the people in the process part they felt we're getting a little bit of short shrift here. So they're really leaning into, what does it take to have a complete protect function? Because it's not just technology and it's not just policies, it's the people and the processes that all wrap around all those things. Resilience is a new protect category. If you've ever heard Mike Hamilton talk, and I won't steal his thunder, but it's, you got to be able to take a punch and get back up and get back to business. So again, the things that we've been, you know, I think here have been, if you've been to any of these, you hear us talking about all the time. Well, it's now being codified into the cybersecurity framework because it's so important. And then
it's
lastly,
funny. Let me just jump in. It's funny that it's in the protect category. I thought at first, and then you explained it to me, and it made more sense. You want to dive in a little why that's in the protect category?
Yeah, protect means,
even though it's about, you know, taking that punch and getting back up, which you would think is, you know, respond, recover, right?
Right. Well, the reason in protect means if you don't do it ahead of time, you cannot be resilient. So that means I have to make sure my backup systems are immutable and that I have, you know, full backups in the way that I want. I have to make sure that I have a cold site or a hot site in which to transfer my operations to in the event of a major cyber attack. These have to be stood up ahead of time because you can't do it after the fact. You know, resilience doesn't work in or retroactively, right? That's why it's in protect. So, and the cybersecurity incident, everybody's come to the conclusion that if you are not able to manage a cyber incident with a great IR plan, a well-trained force of people that have been through tabletop exercises and continually refined their ability to respond, you haven't answered a bunch of questions ahead of time. I think one of the most interesting things lately was 80% of companies say they won't pay ransom. Yet 40% of those companies, when they finally were faced with that, ended up paying the ransom. Okay, so that means you need multiple decision paths. All these things need to be determined before something bad happens. Okay, let's go to the more colorful slide.
And wait, Fred, real quick, before you do, because I heard before this webinar from somebody, and you said something over here about, hey, this is not just critical infrastructure anymore, although critical infrastructure is always really important. It's for all sorts of industries. I'm looking through the folks in the chat. We have folks from tribal organizations, from hotels, casinos, a bunch of other, you know, SaaS providers and like, yeah. So, you know, somebody said, you know, previously, I thought this was just for critical infrastructure. You know, it is for everybody. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'm going to suggest that it's always been for everyone. It was put out to critical infrastructure, right? Because that's the place the government had muscle. That's the place government can step in and say, we have agencies that are managing security for these particular sectors. So it gave them the ability to push and promulgate this approach to securing your infrastructure. But we have always said an outcome-based, non-prescriptive approach is the only way that small to medium-sized business can adopt the same types of controls as a larger enterprise, but doing it in a way that's appropriate for their budget, for their staff, for their character of their business. So we love this because it truly is malleable to any organization. That's why it's appropriate for just about anyone.
Yeah, and I'll go to the next slide here. And as I do, I'm curious for folks in the audience in the chat, you know, have you been aligning to NIST CSF? Have you not? Like, what, you know, what's your history there? All right, Fred, go ahead. Here's the big colorful slide.
There you go. So across the top, we have all of our functions. You see there's that new govern. These colors come from the government. They suggest these colors. So we didn't forget to color in those govern boxes. Actually, white is the color that the government is assigned to that. But what you see here is a little bit of the things that are changing. For example, all those white boxes or those boxes that don't have any color are brand new. All that was migrated from that former governance function. You see the arrow there that got pulled out of identify and now moved into its entirely different function. If you are familiar with the NIST CSF, you may be looking across this and going, you know, some of these titles look close, but they're not identical to what I remember. And I'm going to tell you, you're right. They've adjusted some of the names of some of these particular categories and how they kind of fit together to make it more logical and the way this all fits together. When you get down to the subcategories, which we're not showing here, which is when you get down to the 120 or 130, this is at least in the 1.1, it's going to be more now, subcategories, there are, about 130 or so controls that really you're going to look at here. So you're just seeing here the category level, not all those 130 plus subcategories that you actually are going to assess yourself against. You can also see they've really extended what happened in the respond area. That used to be two particular two categories, is now 4 entire categories. All that stuff I was telling you previously, how they're realizing the importance of resilience and the importance of identifying and responding rapidly. This is when I look at this and I go, well, what have they really done here? Well, governance is important. They're really looking at making sure that we can identify and respond. And then here, the added one in protect, technology, infrastructure, resilience. Well, that's what we just talked about. All these things are getting ready for the same thing. You got to be ready to take a punch and get up off the mat. You see detect and recover. The names have changed a tiny bit, but the things are essentially the same. So when you go, if you've been through this before, the next time you go through it, you're going to have to recalibrate your mind, right? You may want to do a mapping, right? Mapping or 1.1 to the subcategories, because the category names have changed now. So you can't map it that way, but you can map subcategory to subcategory and understand where it then lands within this overall category framework here.
And I would say too that the discussion draft that NIST put out actually does that mapping for you. And I think it's interesting too that they've actually given you a bit of a leg up. There is clearer language on things like external assets. Okay, what does that mean? Well, now it's inventories of external assets and suppliers are maintained. That's the outcome to me, right? Okay, that's a lot clearer. Wait, right? What is that asset? The discussion draft has implementation language in it, right? So like, how would you answer some of the questions? Um, I don't have any examples at the top of my head, like for vulnerability management, right? Well, we do a monthly vulnerability scan, blah, 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 right? How to answer the questions. So I think going through that discussion draft, and I think somebody, Jake, probably has a link for that.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat here
grab
for you all.
grab the PDF and read through it. I think it's like 50 pages or something like that, but you can skim it fairly quickly. And a lot of it is tables, and you read what's in the table, and so you can kind of whiz through there. Yeah. All right. Just wanted to throw that out there because there is pretty good guidance in there that explains that mapping, right? The subcategory mapping.
I always like to take this approach, looking at this slide, and talk about how you approach this as a program. If you look at it, it's really lined up where you're looking at plan, implement, manage and monitor, and then potentially learn from what you found, through the process. So all of your planning activities are govern and identify. You need to build the structure. You need to then understand what your risks are. Protect, of course, is when you're going to go out, you're going to implement your controls. This is where you're managing that vulnerability probability component. Detect, respond, and recover, or where you're going to be managing the entire part of your impact component. So this whole thing really flows from how do I approach this? You start on the left. Start, if you're going to go and start rolling out a roadmap, you're going to start on the left. You're going to start doing those activities, and you're going to work your way through this process to make sure that you've covered every requirement within this.
And just to cap that off, so the governance part of this is super important too. And this is aligned with not only more risk management, because when you identify risks, you should really put that through some kind of risk committee, right? A governance committee that can make the decision whether or not to accept certain risks. And you don't want yours to be the only fingerprints on a decision like that. So the bit about governance being pulled out as its own section there, I think is pretty important. I'll say too that this aligns with some of the regulatory stuff that's coming out of the SEC, for example, for publicly traded corporations, where they're saying, okay, yeah, multi-factor authentication, all this technical stuff, you need board representation. All right, you need somebody who's responsible and accountable. So they're really digging into governance, when it gets to enterprise level corporations that are publicly traded. So this is going to be more and more of a focus that we all need to have. How do we create a committee where we discuss risks, and then everybody decides as a group what you will accept and what you're going to do about the remainder?
And one of the things that I and one of the things I read in healthcare is that, because I see there are a fair number of IT directors from healthcare organizations here, if you don't have a seat at the governance table, for the board and the like, this really sets that up for you to have a bigger voice in the organization, because this is what the government is expecting of you.
Yeah, we'll get to the point where the government is starting to say that HIPAA covered entities should align their risk assessment with the NIST CSF framework.
Oh, they have said that. HHS did say that.
No, they did, right. And that is a sea change approach for people in the healthcare field, and why healthcare people should be in this webinar, because this is going to be your world, the world of HIPAA, and aligning with the OCR audit guides is probably starting to shift to more align with the NIST CSF. I did want to point out, a lot of people are asking about, what does this compare to 853 NIST or NIST 800-171? We've got a whole section. We're going to talk about how to do that. We have, at the end of this deck, we're going to get deeply into how do you manage all these frameworks? How do you understand where your requirements are? How do you map one framework to another? So we'll get to that. Next slide, Jake. I think
if we get through this deck.
If we get through this deck. So Mike's going to take the next slide here.
Okay. All right. So the NIST 800 series is 15 pounds of paper of very prescriptive controls that should only ever be implemented by federal agencies, because nobody else is required to do this. And you would be, insane to do this voluntarily. It's awful. It's like, picking a standard out of the air and go, well, I'm the new CISO and we're going to align with the ISO standard and get, audited against that. And if you don't kill yourself, someone will kill you. So the 800 series that's not what this is. Okay. So again, it's not prescriptive. It does come from the 800 series, but again, converted to an outcome-based framework. NIST 800-171 is the one that is being applied to. It's also a subset being applied to the cybersecurity maturity model certification required, CMMC required, of anybody that does business with the Department of Defense today. Soon it will be any federal agency that you're doing business with. You're going to have to show some kind of certification, right? You're going to have to show your security papers. Well, the one that's used there is 800-171. So if you're aligning with the NIST framework, right, the cybersecurity framework, it's not that big of a jump to go out and bring in the CMMC folks and say, convert what I have done to, compliance with 800-171. It is not prescriptive like the PCI data security standard, criminal justice information services standard, or any of the other actual regulatory frameworks. This is not a regulatory framework. They cannot force you to use it. It's a standard of practice. It's a real good idea to use it. And the leverage they have is, again, the power of the purse, right? Your security is becoming a competitive differentiator. Everybody you do business with wants to see some, documentation of your own security. This is the glide path to get there, but it's not required of anyone. And again, I think Fred talked about Health and Human Services recently put out guidance that said, henceforth, when you do your annual risk assessment, because all hospitals, covered entities have to do a risk assessment annually, they want you to do it against the NIST CSF. And to me, they just gave you a gift, because it's so easy to use for this. And let's get through this so we can look at an example of how how we use it and how other organizations that I work with are using it.
Fred, anything you want to add on this? I know there have been a
Yeah,
bunch of questions in the chat
yeah,
about 800 and CMMC and the like.
yeah. Well, like I said, I'll get to that on a particular site, but I think the fact that the HHS is saying use this for HIPAA, and the fact that this CSF is not a risk assessment framework, it's a gap analysis against the standard. It's also showing you, though, that the NIST CSF is easily adaptable to a risk assessment approach. And the payoff for everybody on this call is going to be getting the tool that Mike has built to turn the NIST CSF into a risk assessment framework. So you're going to get a great present at the end of this.
I did the easy stuff. Lou did the hard stuff. To be clear.
All right, Fred, usage example.
You bet. Okay, so let's talk about healthcare here. One thing we have been talking about to our clients for a long time, and we've been saying to them, you know what? I know you want to do your HIPAA risk assessment, but you're only looking at EPHI. The bad guys now are going to attack systems that probably don't have EPHI, and then they're going to pivot and they're going to attack the systems that do. So if you're not looking holistically at everything in your enterprise, you're not protecting EPHI, because that's not how the bad guys work, right? So understanding that protecting everything in your organization is important. We've always said to healthcare organizations, why don't you alternate between a NIST CSF 1 year of the whole organization and your HIPAA risk assessment on just your EPHI data? Well, we're getting to the point where let's just do NIST CSF for our HIPAA risk assessment approach. This makes a ton of sense, again, because finally you're looking at everything that presents risk to EPHI, because you could carve that stuff off before. HIPAA was written, and if you know my background, I actually contributed to HIPAA back in the mid-90s. We were taking a first shot at this stuff when we did this. So this is really a great evolution of where we really were hoping to get to. When you're taking something and turning it from a gap analysis, a standards-based gap analysis, and turning it into a risk assessment, you're adding impacts and the likelihood of that missing control being taken advantage of, right? A bad guy's going to see you got a vulnerability, and I'm going to take advantage of that, right? So you got to understand that particular likelihood component and the impact component. As Mike said, it's not I had a SQL injection attack. It's we lost 50 records because that SQL injection coughed up our entire patient database to the bad guy, right? So you got to, in any risk assessment, and people are not good at this, folks. And HHS came out about 10 years ago saying, hey, we're getting hundreds of these risk assessments, and none of them are actually risk assessments. So you have to get good at understanding what the bad things that can happen are. Doesn't mean you need to come up with a dollar value. In fact, I highly recommend people don't work on dollar values. I would go with high, medium, and low, or critical, high, medium, low impact.
Right.
And that way, I have to spend all my time on these assets that are marked critical, that have these high risk vulnerabilities, right? So that's how you bring into impact. You bring out the bad things that can happen. You tie it to the vulnerabilities and how easy or hard it may be to take advantage of those. And you build a risk assessment around that. It's not limited to data or a particular regulation is designed to protect. When we talk about most standards, if it's CMMC, we're talking about, data that's classified, right? Or excuse me, it's non-classified data, but it's sensitive data to the government. It's a very specific type of data. This is everything, right? You want to protect HR, you want to protect your production environment, you want to protect your sales force, you want to protect the back office, you want to protect everyone, right? So this is a true enterprise approach. It's finally looking at everything. And if you want, then this will be leading into our crosswalking discussion a little bit in a few minutes. Here is a link to a NIST CSF crosswalk. This is 1.1. I will warn you, right? Nobody's got 2.0 yet to start building the crosswalk, but you can go out and easily get, and this is put out by Department of Health and Human Services. Here, they're already crosswalking this CSF to the HIPAA, right? So if you need to do this crosswalking, you can take your previous HIPAA assessment, take the crosswalk, map your existing controls immediately into this CSF, and you have just skipped, maybe 2 weeks worth of work and interviews and control reviews to get to where you have a great starting point based on the information you already have. Crosswalking is a hugely valuable skill that we believe everybody needs to get good at. And the best part is there are tons of resources out there helping you to do crosswalking. Next slide, Jake. All right. So what is compliance crosswalking? So I'll crow again a little bit here. I was part of a group called the Risk Management Alliance in 2001 that made, I think, the first publication of what this means, called the Unified Approach to Compliance. I wish I'd trademarked that. I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere. So what is it? It's compiling all the regulations and all the standards you want to comply with, bringing them together and saying, what is the intersection of these? And what you find when you're, say, I take credit cards at my hospital, I need PCI, so I need to comply with PCI in part of my environment. I need EPHI, I have healthcare, I need HIPAA, I need to have that set of regulations. I may have other things being pushed on me. If I'm a vendor, I maybe have requirements being pushed on as part of a business agreement that I'm signing with a particular entity. Take all of these requirements, put them into a matrix, understand the environments they particularly address, and then build a key. Build one particular standard that you're saying, this is the one we're going to align with, and then we're going to map all of those controls we have for our key, the main thing we're complying with, to all of the other standards. If you do this effectively, you will find out whatever you've done in your main standard you're keying on will map directly and cover the requirements of another standard. Occasionally, you will find there are some elements in one standard that don't exist in another. You may need to add, a couple things to say to cover these other standards. But the idea is to go out and do an assessment of every control, map it to every standard, and do this all in one effort, rather than going out and doing your annual PCI assessment and then a HIPAA assessment, and then trying to map these things into some master plan and master roadmap that you go out and execute against for the rest of the year. Don't do it that way. Do it the easy way. Bring it all together, one roof, one set of standards that you compiled and brought together and aligned across a key primary compliance standard you want to measure against. So ensure you understand the scope of each standard, right? HIPAA is EPHI. PCI is credit cards. They live in the same building, if you will, but they may not even have much intersection. So understand how those environments intersect if you're doing this. And again, the whole concept here is assess once for all compliance regimes. If you want to go out and build your own crosswalks, there's a company out there that'll let you build a crosswalk. I think over 228 standards. You can map any standard to any standard for free. Now, if you want to map 3 or 4 standards and have it build your compliance crosswalk, it's like $500. Okay, that's a pretty cheap investment to have it go out and automatically build a 5 regulatory regime crosswalk standard, so you have a single standard you're measuring yourself against. But taking this approach means nothing gets left out when you're doing your budgeting, when you're doing your planning. Everything you need to do is being mapped out, rather than what are we doing for HIPAA? What are we doing for CMMC if we're a defense contractor? What about FFIEC and banking, right? So bring these standards together, bring all the things you need to do together, map them as a single compliance framework, and address it holistically when you're doing this. Saves you money, saves you headaches, saves you time, and frankly makes you, I think, overall more secure, because no rock is getting left unturned when you're doing this.
All right, Mike. So, Fred, so 2 things. One, Fred, there are some questions for you about links in the chat. You can go look at those now and maybe answer. So one of the things that Fred previewed was Mike's spreadsheet tool that he came up, that he worked on with Lou. So Mike, if you want to take over and show the spreadsheet tool, now is your time.
I do. I want to quickly just repackage everything that Fred just said. If you have multiple regulatory requirements, and so every one of them says you got to have a firewall, you only have to have a firewall once, right? So consolidating these things and playing from this consolidated sheet of music means that you can handle, especially if you're using some kind of audit tool, for example, where you're inserting all your information in so that auditors can get to it later, really streamline stuff. I don't know how many folks are actually audited. I suspect, looking at affiliations here, that a lot of you are. That turns out to be really handy. Okay, so let me take over the screen from Jake because he doesn't do it right. Well, I guess he does. Okay, so what Lou was able to hack into this spreadsheet were the bits about scoring against a maturity model. And as you see along the bottom tabs here, there's the spider chart with the overall results, right? So we're going to have to modify this, and we're going to have to put the governance section in there. Some of the stuff is going to have to get changed. This is the slide that Jake just showed you with the results in pie chart form, and also the summary of where you need to apply corrective actions, right? Just in terms of the risk that was identified in those different focus areas. So that's actually pretty straightforward. When we look at how to use this, so I'm just going to go to the first bucket right here, and you can see that Lou has also done the crosswalk here that Fred just talked about, so that makes this pretty handy. So again, it's outcome based. So here's the very first outcome to meet in the identify focus area or domain. Physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Okay, that's really straightforward. Hardly any of us know everything that's on our networks. Okay, and there are great inventory systems, and if you're a larger enterprise, maybe you use one of those. If you're a smaller organization like us, you know, it's a lot of manual work combined with our vulnerability scan data, which helps us identify, you know, OS fingerprinting and things like that. So, you know, reasonably, it needs to improve. I mean, you know, pretty much everybody can say that. This is really, you should put in a little more detail than needs to improve, and you should say what the status is of your ability to inventory devices and systems. Now, what we've added here are these columns for likelihood and consequence. These aren't part of the original the NIST framework, right? Because the framework is about aligning you with a standard of practice. However, if you add this information on likelihood and impact, you turn it from we have failed to fully meet this outcome, therefore there's a gap we need to fill, to we've identified this risk. Okay. Now, by virtue of the fact that everyone has to do an annual risk assessment, that is the more and more of an expectation. If you know, if you're regulated, that's already there. If you're not regulated, it's your shareholders, your investors, your business partners, your customers all have these expectations that you're going to be doing these things correctly. Okay, so the likelihood. Now remember, and there's instructions that are embedded in here as well, but when we say what's the likelihood that something bad could happen, remember what that something bad is: unauthorized disclosure of protected records, theft, extortion, disruption, or being used to attack others. I mean, you can fairly put just about every outcome in those 5 buckets. And I like to simplify things, and you know, rather than let things spiral out of control with, you know, technical handshake language. So these are all pull downs, and you can figure out what the likelihood is of one of those things happening based on your failure to know everything that's on your network in this case. Okay. So could something happen because you don't know there's a Windows 2003 server running under the desk of someone in the police department? Okay, that's a real example. Yeah, I mean, something could happen. All right, because we don't have a really good inventory. So you got to think through it. So here are your choices, right? And these all have definitions in the very last tab here that we'll get to. So you've got a little primer on how to pick one of these, right? Like what fraction of the time, how frequently would something like this happen, to call it not likely or low likelihood. But let's leave it at low likelihood. Well, let's say that did happen, and there's a Windows 2003 server on the network that someone was able to compromise, and that's their launch spot now for the ransomware and taking your organization down. That's major. Okay, the impact there would be major. So we can pick that. There's also moderate, minor, right, catastrophic, and again, there are definitions for these all on the last tab. Okay, now risk being the product of these two terms. Okay, so if you have a low likelihood of something, but the impact would be really bad, low times really bad is somewhere in the middle. Okay, it's kind of like, well, let's earth science analogy. So the 9.0 earthquake is going to hit right where we are. All right, it's a low likelihood, which is getting to be more likely as time goes on, but the impact, right, the consequence there, definitely catastrophic. Okay, so we're at somewhere in medium risk for earthquake carnage right now in the Pacific Northwest, right? So you can have a low likelihood of something, but if the impact is going to be so bad, you multiply those together, you're somewhere in the middle. Okay. All right. Then we say, okay, so here's where we pick, our risk, right? You multiply these together, and there's a little bit of, finesse to this, as you think about it. I would recommend, just as Fred said, doing this as a high, medium, low, and not trying to really get your thought process all the way into what's our financial risk here, right? Some of that's easy to do. For example, unauthorized disclosure of protected records, you can call them worth $200 a piece. Million records, $200 million in potential liability. Okay, that stuff is easy. Some of the others are not so easy. So pick your risk there. Low times major is medium. All right. What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? Well, there's only 4 choices. We can accept the risk. Again, needs to go through governance, and you need to get fingerprints on that. We can avoid the risk, turn off that Windows 2003 machine. The risk is gone. We can mitigate that risk through the application of controls, which is probably going to cost some money, or we can transfer that risk through insurance. That's all you can do with risk. So you pick the one you do. We are going to mitigate this. All right. All right. Which means we're going to fix it. All right. Well, what's our corrective action? So you put a corrective action in there. We're going to create an inventory, and we're going to maintain that as time goes on. All right. So now what we've identified a risk. We've said what we're going to do about it. We've developed a corrective action, right? How are we going to deliver that corrective action? Are we going to do that with internal resources where we know, average $50 an hour? I mean, it's pretty easy to figure that one out. Are we going to bring in a professional services or managed services, right? Then you just go get bids for it. Or is this going to be a capital purchase where we just go find out, get a VAR to price something for you, and then add 20% to that for the rest of time for maintenance fees? So now we know what our corrective action is. Now we know how we're going to deliver this. And so once you tally all this stuff up, every time you see, well, we're going to do this with internal labor, you can figure out, well, for back of the envelope project plan, how many hours is that going to take? And then you multiply that by the average hourly wage. And now you have a number that you can assign. It will cost us X to fix this. Okay. This one is, and this was brilliant idea by Lou. You can put in, are we the same as last year? Did we improve, or did we slide back? And so in the results, you may have noticed there's charts there for how many things we improved on, how many things we slid back on, and how many things are exactly in the same shape they were last year. All right. And then these two right here, you pick a maturity level. I've arbitrarily set everything to 3. And honestly, to get past a 3, you need to be, a Lockheed and really be throwing a lot of resources at this. So 3 actually is probably as achievable as most organizations are going to get using this methodology. And there's our crosswalk. Okay. So every one of the focus areas here, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and soon to be govern, is handled like this. And you can see there's a whole lot of these guys down here. I've left some samples in here, the corrective action, nothing to do. We're doing this okay. We understand our roles and responsibilities. So we're just going to continuously improve. Technically, if you say you're up to continuous improvement, that's really a level 5 in the maturity model. but apply your own error bars there. Okay, so this one has got a lot in it, right? And then there's an individual spider chart score for every one of the focus areas. So there's our identify. And what you can see is the blue around here, that's where we arbitrarily set the maturity level that we want to achieve to 3. And you can see exactly how this particular run made it. And then there's the results that come down after this, and plus the definitions here of what maturity model means. Okay, so then Protect has its own questionnaire. All right, it's about as long. This is probably the longest one in here. And then Protect gets its own chart. Okay, again, with all of this same information down here summarized for you. That tells you how you're doing in a graphical form. This is really good for executive reporting, especially year on year, because you want to show improvement. Okay, here is Detect. So, right, a lot of these, the outcome is being met by the SOC and Microsoft monitoring. Detect wants you to monitor your network, be able to investigate and confirm things that are going on, and have a plan for what to do. So this last time we went through this, it was with one of our managed service customers. So a whole bunch of it is, well, this outcome is being met because you have a SOC full of people watching your network 24/7.
Cool. And one thing here. So I did put a link to this in the chat to the spreadsheet. It's a download link. So if you click it, understand that it will download on your computer. It's an Excel file. Somebody sent me a
Download or
note.
detonate?
We do not. No, we don't have it in Google Sheets, and no, Mike hasn't put govern in it because it's not official yet.
Right. So this entire presentation is worthless as of tomorrow.
I will also say that Mike has offered to go through it with folks on a, if you and your organization want to go through the spreadsheet, and I'm going to put another link in the chat. Ellie helps Mike with his calendar, and so if you want to book
Thank
time,
God.
Ellie will do the calendar hockey thing. So pick a time that's good for you. Ellie will do the calendar ping pong thing, and if you want to go through it with Mike for your organization, he's happy to do it. So both of those links are in the chat. We will also email them out. So if you're not watching this live and you can't see the chat, we'll email out the link to the spreadsheet as well. Okay, Mike, anything you want to say wrapping this up, or can I move to the next thing?
Let me just get through. So here's the respond bucket. Here's the respond chart, and then you get into recover. Recover is extremely short. You see there's not much to it. And then here's all the matrix codes again in here. So if you need a little primer on what am I calling likely, what am I calling, medium risk, et cetera, it's got all that stuff in here. Okay, Jake, back to you.
All right. And Vincent asks, will we have a version with governance in it, with govern in it? Mike will do that because we'll make him do it. So the answer is yes. But only when it's out. And Fred, this actually takes us to our next slide, the next question, which is, Doug's question about, are we going to use this tool with risk assessment engagements? And, one of the things we're going to do, obviously, is to, not just give recommendations, but give recommendations of service mappings to say, okay, here's how you solve this. Fred, go for it.
Sure. So a lot of this is, well, what do we do? What exactly kind of things can we go do to solve these problems? So just putting some things into some of the broad categories that we have seen overall after doing, as Jake said, probably 500-600 of these. This is the areas where we see people falling out consistently. So if you're in the protect domain, if you're familiar with the NIST CSF, whole bunch of that protect is about knowing your assets, hardware and software assets. So you need somebody, obviously, to oversee this program, because if nobody's overseeing things and managing how you're managing these assets and the security around them, then you're got a ship with no captain, right? So you got to have somebody, a CISO in there, maybe a virtual CISO if you come to us. We can help you develop policies and procedures, or you should be doing that yourself. And you should have systems, not only that can go out and identify hardware and software, but keep version numbers, keep this as a inventory asset that you can continuously review and maintain. On the governance component, right? Well, this is where you got to have somebody in charge. Somebody's got to be helping make these decisions. You need policy to define governance. A lot of people don't realize the first policy you need is your master information security policy. And that is not your policy set. That is the policy that says, here is who is in charge of making decisions. Here are the committees and the boards we report to. Here is how we delegate risk management authority. It's the overarching, here's who's in charge, and here's who's responsible, and here's who makes the decisions. And you got to make sure that you're including things like change control processes, all the sub processes that are part of governance that you got to document for an audit. So if you're not doing that, you're not going to pass an audit, right? Risk management, key part of what HIPAA and a lot of these things are trying to do. Again, you need somebody to steer the ship. You need an annual risk assessment to understand where you're at. You need to have a compliance program to make sure that you're complying. You need a policy to then enforce all that. But what we talk about, that's part of this whole framework here, right? That risk management strategy really is applying the NIST cybersecurity framework as an assessment tool to then develop a roadmap and understand your risks. Identity management, access control. Everybody knows that that's kind of the key to one of the keys to security. If you're going to focus on something, have a really good access control policy. We come in and see access control policies that are, they're there to check a box. And that's really not a good strategy, since this is one of your key aspects of protecting your organization. Understanding how you provision and deprovision users. I've never been to a company that doesn't fall down somewhere in this process and leave customers, or you leave employees with excess rights that they've carried with them since they joined the organization, or they're not turning people off on a timely basis, and that's really a bad practice. Security awareness and training. If you need us to come in and build a security awareness training program, we like that. We do that all the time. We're moving to something broader. We call it securing the human. Okay. It's not just enough to do training. You need a full social engineering program. Has phishing, smishing, right? SMS style phishing, vishing, voice fraud, trying to defraud somebody using voice. That's the easiest of all, folks. Calling into somebody and convincing them to do something on your behalf, just talking to them. What about the physical? How easy is it to talk your way past the front door, walk out with a bunch of computers and servers under your arm? Pretty easy at most places. And what about the fact that everybody gets 50 phishing emails a week or more? Well, you need a way for your users to go, is this something I open or not? You should have something, a phishing verification service that says, don't open this email. Right? This is bad. This has a link to a bad guy site, or it's going to steal your password. It has a malware attached to it. So you need this whole element to secure the human. It's training. It's exercises. It's the tools to help them not make mistakes, right? So these are critical components to work in. And monitoring and response, as core for us here. It's core for that entire half of, identify, respond, recover is all about this, right? And if you don't have something to watch your network 24/7, like managed detection and response, or your own internal team that never sleeps and never takes a vacation. You should be watching your endpoint. You should be watching your cloud. You should be watching IoT devices when you're looking. You should be able to take rapid quarantine actions. Let's go ahead and isolate that system, even if we can't get to it right now, so it stops doing bad things. And you need to have people, right? An incident response team that you have, or you need to have probably someone on retainer, because when bad things happen, especially if they're part of a major event, you will be left in the dark if you don't have a retainer with somebody, because they've already got 60 calls that day and they can only handle 20 of those clients. So if you don't already have somebody lined up, you don't ever have a contract in place, wow, that's we see people we turn away, and it's horrible to turn somebody away when they need help, but we just can't help them. And a lot of times we don't even know who to send them to because nobody has time.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, and I see there are questions about the spreadsheet. So a couple of things. Number one, these are the services we provide, which map, of course, to different parts of the NIST framework. Also, my colleague Ginny is going to put in the chat a survey link. At the end of every webinar, we like to know how we did. Did you like it? All of that. Also, at the very end of that, is a place where you can say, hey, I want to chat with you all to figure out how to do this a little bit better. The other thing to know about the survey is for everybody who takes the survey, we make a donation to the Society for Information Management, which is a charity that a bunch of our customers belong to, and they do an amazing job training people. Also, Fred talked about security awareness training. We do it for free every other week. And you can sign up for that on our website. And of course, our YouTube channel has all of these. Okay, so you can schedule time with Mike by clicking on that link that I'd emailed before, or that I'd put in the chat before, to book time with Ellie, who'll do his calendar. You can email me, you can email him, and please take the survey. All right, we're coming up to time here. Quick final thoughts. Mike, you first, then Fred.
If you take the advice we just gave you and you use this sheet as your risk assessment sheet, you will end up with a completed risk assessment, which is a regulatory or standard of practice requirement, a corrective action roadmap that you can run out 1 or 2 years, depending on whether or not you have a biennial budget, and budget asks for the stuff you're going to need.
All right, Fred, final thoughts.
Long live the NIST CSF. And we've been waving that flag for a long time, and we're going to keep waving it probably to the day I leave this mortal coil. So
I feel like we I feel like that's
You're
not
ending
an
on a downer
uplifting
there.
end. Yeah. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We will send out the YouTube link. We'll send out the presentation. We'll send out the link to the spreadsheet. If you're watching this later on YouTube and you need anything, shoot me an email, jake@criticalinsight.com. Happy to get it to you. On behalf of Fred, Mike, and everyone here at Critical Insight, have an awesome day, and thanks so much for being here, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye, everybody.